Grand Theft Auto V is a legendary game. By my colleague John Linneman's standards, it needs only a little bit more than a year till its 10th birthday, and then it can be considered retro even. So it's no spring chicken anymore, but the game still is looking visually rather okay, and importantly, it is one of the most successful games on Earth, thanks in no part due to GTA Online. As has become customary at Rockstar, the game is once again being re-released for current-gen consoles, promising to enhance visuals, enhance performance, and perhaps even more. So in today's video on Digital Foundry, I will be looking into Grand Theft Auto V's newest release. I will use the PlayStation 5 version as representative of the current gen to see how this re-release compares to the 2015 re-release on PlayStation 4, as well as examining how it compares to the older PC version of GTA 5 without the enhancements running on an ultra high-end configuration at max settings. Are the changes massive, or is this your standard cross-gen upgrade? Cross-platform comparisons and performance analysis in general will be done in a separate video by my colleague Tom Morgan. But even without all the cross-platform analysis, there's a lot to get into here in this video, and before I get into those visual comparisons, I think the best place to start is at the very beginning, just loading the game up. After downloading and starting up from the PS5 dashboard, I noticed rather quickly how different the experience is this time than the last gen one on PS4. On PS4, after downloading and starting, you would see these series of screens when booting up the game. GTA 5 needs its own separate installation process after downloading. And let me tell you, whoa, this process is incredibly slow. On my end, it took over just an hour on the 5400 RPM hard drive of the PS4. On PS5, there's much less friction in comparison. You just click play, there's some startup videos, and from there on, you can start customizing the game in the menu at a full tick 60 FPS. This already feels a lot better than PS4, and it is even better feeling than PC in my opinion, whose menus default to 30 FPS for some reason. From here on, you can load into the campaign or GTA Online, with the only bit of friction being the Rockstar Social Club login, which you can thankfully ignore in the campaign should you so wish. After skipping that on PS5, there's about a 20-second boot load into the campaign. A comparably short startup with unfussy menus and okay boot loading times to get things rolling. It's definitely not lightning fast as we've seen in other current gen releases with that 20-second load there, but it's quite a bit better than the old version of the game on a high-end spec PC, and it's a lot better than the PlayStation 4. That first initial boot load on PlayStation 4 takes just about 2 minutes and 8 seconds. That is 6 times slower than the load time on PlayStation 5, and as you can see in the bottom right here, it's just enough time for a Doom veteran such as myself to complete Map 1 and Map 2 of Doom's first episode, with time to spare even on Map 3. Truly, when you look at load or boot times for games on the Xbox One or PS4, I do wonder what people thought about them back in the day, as now in 2022, I find this long boot on PlayStation 4 an absolute chore. Beyond loading and usability, one of the other first upgrades noticed on PlayStation 5 in the campaign immediately was due to the high-performance RT mode I was playing the game in. On Xbox One and PlayStation 4, the game ran, of course, limited to a 30 FPS cap, including in-game cutscenes. On PC at release, you could run that at whatever frame rate you wanted based on your hardware, but the game's cutscenes still ran rather oddly. They would render out at 60 FPS, but if you watch the animations of the camera or characters, you could see that they were stopping and starting. They looked jerky. With the PS5 release, I can confirm, thankfully, that the character animation stutter in cutscenes seems largely reduced or completely eliminated, and you can see this when I put it side by side with the PC version at 60 FPS. Camera animation, though, still to my eye seems imperfect and does not look like a proper 60 FPS always to me. So not everything is fixed up. Other imperfections I noticed are that all cloth effects still run at a lower frame rate, like these little flaps here seen hanging above our character, or this dancing advertisement thing that you see outside the car dealership. Adding to this enhanced smoothness over the last releases are the changes to image post-processing. First, you have the change to motion blur. Back in the original release, motion blur was camera-based, excluding some movements in first-person mode, which had a very subtle object motion blur applied to them. In the new version, per object blur is applied universally throughout the whole game. Here you can see the difference per object blur makes on the hands of the character here in the cutscene. When he flicks the cigarette away, his hands move quickly, and you can see a rather subtle motion blur on his hands and on the cigarette. It's subtle here at 60 FPS as I'm showing, but it will become more obvious at 30 FPS. In general, you can see this per object blur on really fast movements. So, like Franklin here punching, and as his body moves rapidly across the screen, if you look, you can see some of that motion blur on them. Or it's rather visible on cars that zip by within the span of a few frames. Yep, there's some nice looking motion blur right there. This will definitely make the game's 30 FPS mode, as you're seeing right here, more fluid than any version before, and will add a layer of seamlessness to the 60 FPS mode that I find quite good looking. It's not exactly an in-your-face implementation of motion blur here, and you may not have noticed it until I pointed it out, but it will definitely help this game look smoother in motion than the previous releases. Another additive aspect of smoothness is due to image quality. Back on PlayStation 4, the game ran at 1080p with a simple FXAA post-process anti-aliasing. It's kind of typical for the time of release, but in motion the game had a lot of issues. There's a lot of dithering in hair, like you see here. Objects loading in the distance always have a dither that's really obvious in them, and the image lacks stability in motion. It's very aliased. On PC there were better anti-aliasing options like MSAA and even a temporal AA by Nvidia called TXAA. This is what I'm running in the PC footage seen in this video, as well as with a layer of FXAA on top. You could get decent image quality out of the PC version, but at a high cost. For example, look at the difference in image quality of these background trees here in the scene on PC and PS4. Very flickery on PS4, with higher res and much more expensive AA. On PC, it looks quite a bit better. On PlayStation 5, things are different as the tech in the industry has changed since then. The game now uses a standard accumulation-style temporal AA similar to the one might find in Red Dead Redemption 2. This does a lot of heavy lifting to make the game have very little aliasing. For example, look at that tree I talked about earlier. Here PS5 with its new TAA fares a lot better than the original game and is surprisingly comparable to the image on PC, which is much higher res and uses much more expensive anti-aliasing. This new TAA also handles some aspects of aliasing quite a bit better than even found on the super pumped up PC version of old, like specular aliasing. This intro area of the game shows it off. On PC, moving back and forth, it's easy to see how these wet areas on the ground produce aliasing and flicker even at native 4K with these expensive AA options on. PS5 in its RT performance mode, even at its lower 1440p resolution, manages to clean up that shimmer much better than what is possible on PC. TAA of this style is great, but it has limitations, like after rapid movements or camera cuts. Like here after this camera cut, you can see that the game does not have much anti-aliasing on PlayStation 5, looking jagged, whereas the PC version with MSAA and FXAA looks much cleaner on camera cuts in comparison. Other issues I noticed with this new TAA were some light ghosting as well as instability of the resolve, like here on the car at a distance, where you can see it kind of jiggling. That doesn't happen on the other versions. In general though, I would say the game is much smoother now in motion, and the TAA does a good job. It also seems to plug into other screen elements like ambient occlusion. Check this out, here's the old version of the game on PC, max settings, 4K, PCSS shadows, TXA, etc, etc. I can barely go higher, yet look at this building here in the distance as I slow down the footage. Pay attention to the darker regions in the shadows. Notice how they flicker. The PC version's screen space ambient occlusion has limitations of its own and causes the game to have a bit of flicker in spite of the ultra high settings. You can see this in other moments as well, like the car door in this cutscene. If I ping it back and forth, you can definitely see how the AO flickers rather badly. Now on PlayStation 5, the AO I think combines with the TAA in some way and gets rid of that flicker. So even though the resolution can be lower on PlayStation 5 depending upon the mode you're playing, it will definitely have less flicker and more pleasing presentation and motion than the ultra spec PC version of old. A similar upgrade in smoothness is found in shadows. First of all indoor shadows from artificial lights on PlayStation 5 in all modes are still handled by shadow maps, but the shadow maps seem of a high quality and have generally good filtering. Compare that with the PC version or the PS4 version and you can see what I mean. The PC version on a number of shadows actually looks rather jagged. The PS4 version has blobby dithered shadows, and the PS5 look rather nice. Outdoor shadows, though, is where you see the biggest change in the new version, as the Fidelity or Performance RT modes in GTA 5 use ray trace shadows from the sun. If you've watched a DF video before, you probably know what ray trace shadows do and what advantages they have, but I'm going to list a couple of the obvious ones here visible in GTA 5. For one, they flicker less. In cutscenes like this one, when the character is lit up by the sun, there's now no shadow aliasing, causing distracting flicker that you can see on the older versions of the game. This applies to close-ups, as well as any outdoor scene where the sun is moving, which is always, as that can also cause flicker in shadow maps that RT shadows just don't have. RT shadows also eliminate cascade issues, like you can see here on the original PS4 version. Moving back and forth and looking at your character here and around them, you can see how the resolution of the shadows change based upon the distance from the character model. There's essentially a box around the character that has high-res sharp shadows, and a box outside that where the shadows become really blobby. That is not how shadows work at all in the real world, of course, and this moving line of shadow resolution is distracting. With ray tracing on in a similar scene, there's no such thing. Even the maxed out PC version of old shows off cascade issues, like you can see here where the shadow blips momentarily, which is not visible at all in the PlayStation 5 version with RT on. And lastly, ray tracing shadows simulate realistic properties found in real life and avoid many issues shadow maps have. To show you what I mean, here's a specific scene on PS4, PS5 without RT shadows, PS5 with RT shadows at 60 FPS, and the old PC version maxed out with NVIDIA PCSS. In the performance mode on PS5 without RT, we're seeing a usage of percentage closer shadow maps like we see on the PC max settings, but a custom one that Rockstar made and has been used in other titles from them. In all of the shadow maps here on PC, PS5, and PS4, there are issues. For one, you can see obvious Peter Panning issues, as they're called. For example, where the struts or corrugated metal touch the wall. Peter Panning is the term used to describe how light leaks through these objects and cannot be rendered correctly. Ray trace shadows do not have this issue. On top of this, ray trace shadows can show off very realistic softening. Those PCSS type shadows, as shown off on PS5's non-RT mode or the old version on the PC, show off a level of contact hardening, as we can see here in the shadow, but it's just emulating the look, and it's not exactly right in either case. For example, look at this other comparison to NVIDIA's PCSS in the old version on PC. With the grass on the ground here, we can see how PS5 with ray tracing does not have that obvious gap between the shadow and the grass casting it as found on the PC version. We can also see a PCSS error here. Notice how the shadows from the power lines above intersect with the grass shadows, and on PC this causes a weird haloing artifact. This is not something that happens with ray tracing. There are other visual advantages that RT shadows have, but these are the differences that will stand out. RT shadows look great in this game, I think, on average, and they're definitely better than the options available before, but that does not mean they are perfect. The game has some compromises to make them run well. For example, they can fizzle or pop in ways due to being lower resolution. Or here you can see that same thing happening when the camera moves with the thin wiring in the distance. There are also moments, like here at this angle, where you can see the shadow has some visible pixelization lines in them. The fidelity mode does not eliminate these issues, rather just makes the shadows more accurate due to the per pixel nature of ray tracing. On that more negative note, there are some other aspects of the presentation that are less than perfect in spite of the re-release update here, the most obvious of which is anisotropic filtering. As you can see in this comparison screenshot, PC versus PS4 versus PS5, the road after a certain distance looks rather blurry on PS4 and PS5. The PS5 seems to use a similar level of anisotropic filtering as the last gen console. I find this a shame that they did not upgrade this to something like 8xAF, as that would help the game's visuals quite a bit. Then there's general LOD and rendering distance. Back in the day, there was a lot of controversy that PlayStation 4 had more grass than the Xbox One version. The funny thing is that the PC version had an even greater difference than the PS4 and Xbox One version. Curiously, they've decided to not really upgrade this as much on PlayStation 5 as you might think. It's maybe not surprising given how GPU intensive this option can be, but it is that way in this release. Another thing is that the geometry LOD at a distance as shown here, is similar to the PS4 version. On PC at a distance, you can see the cemetery is replete with a lot of detail here that PS4 or PS5 in the 60 FPS mode do not have and look rather barren in comparison. PS5 seems to have the same LOD and geometry quality as PS4 based upon this testing, and if you look close you can even see the same semi-transparent dither of an object at this distance on PlayStation 5 and PS4. It's just that PS5's TAA makes it much less obvious, thankfully. The only upgrade to LOD that you can find in this re-release is in the fidelity mode, where here on PlayStation 5 that drops the game down to 30 FPS and it pumps the grass up to a much higher level, and it looks visibly much better using that extra GPU headroom. But sadly, it does not affect the LOD at a distance for opaque geometry, which appears to be the same still as that PlayStation 4 version. These are expensive settings on PC, but I would have liked to have seen another mode on PlayStation 5 targeting 60 FPS with some of these things turned higher. And with that being said, those are the primary differences of this new version. There are some other smaller differences, like how fire effects use a new sprite and spawn lights of a different color, or the fact that depth of field no longer turns practically invisible at higher resolution like we see on the PC version of old. But those are more niche in comparison to the other larger changes I've already outlined. I did try and look for other changes at night, for example, perhaps new lighting effects or new areas with shadows, but this new release seems very similar to the old in that regard. One change I did not see but felt was the inclusion of DualSense features on PlayStation 5. Driving has a bit of tension on the triggers due to the brakes, and haptics are used to cause jitter on the controller based upon driving conditions on the road. Water, like from these sprinklers here seen in the initial scene in the game, as well as from rain, cause haptic feedback as seen in other PS5 titles. This is standard stuff and not exactly game-changing, but it's nice for those who enjoy this kind of thing. Throughout this video, I've been showing off the game running in high-performance RT mode, but the game does have two other modes, one without RT and a potentially higher than 1440p resolution and potentially higher performance, and the fidelity mode, which runs at 30 FPS and goes for a higher res with RT and a few other enhancements. Other than the grass I mentioned earlier being visibly better in the fidelity mode, another difference with the fidelity mode is how the resolution of cube map reflections is higher, which you can see on the car here in this cutscene. Between the modes, I find the fidelity mode rather flawless looking, but somewhat barren in geometry quality at a distance due to the lack of upgrades there. It also means playing the game at 30 FPS. Yes, the new per object motion blur helps the game out visually to look less framey in this mode, but the game's control still feels super sluggish in my opinion. Like other Rockstar games, this game has really high animation prioritization, and it can feel rather unresponsive, and 30 FPS exacerbates this feeling. And thus I recommend everyone playing this game to look into the 60 FPS modes, specifically that 60 FPS RT mode, which I think has held up rather well in my play experience, especially in comparison to the last gen version of the game. That PS4 version could trip up rather often when just driving around the city, dropping below 30 FPS. The new version, even in 60 FPS RT mode, does not seem to have that happen in similar settings. But that performance discussion is more the purview of my colleague Tom Morgan's video, and with that we've reached the end of my video. This is technically my favorite version of GTA 5 yet. It is the smoothest visually with new motion blur and fixed up cinematics. Yes, it is still lacking in some ways next to that PC version maxed out, but I did not find myself usually bothered by those differences in gameplay, or when I was just futzing around the city. Versus the PlayStation 4 version of old, the differences are large mainly due to the 60 FPS, higher resolution, TAA, and RT shadows, which are awesome and run really nicely for an open world game, it must be said. This update does not vastly change the game like Metro Exodus's Enhanced Edition, but it's also not one of the smallest visual updates we've seen to a game. It's fine for what it costs. But that is enough from me for now. If you did like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about GTA 5, well, write a comment below or follow me on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.